substitutes today? Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah. Go on substituting for chair.
Yeah. Okay, Josh, that's great. Thank you very much. And I think that also Councillor Maureen is going to be a bit late. So I think she's caught in a traffic jam. Yes. Are you substituting?
Yes, substituting for Jo Martindale for Community Works.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for letting me know. You can write that down. Okay. So,
Councillor Meadows substituting for Councillor Lyons.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor Meadows. Yeah, hopefully Councillor Winder will be here soon. Right. So, do any members wish to declare any interest in relation to any matters included on the agenda? And we have no part 2 items today, so the press and public won't be excluded. So Sarah, you're here for the whole thing. Okay. So we have draft minutes from the People Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting of the 8th of July to approve. So do members agree that the draft minutes are an accurate record? Yes, agreed. Okay, thank you. And we have one public question today. Mr. Catt is joining us in person to ask a question. Mr. Catt, would you like to come forward and ask your question? If you sit at the table and you can press, I think, have they shown you how to do it? Okay, that's great.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for allowing me to come today. And my name is Lee Catt. I'm the resident co-chair for Central Area Panel. I'm also a resident and tenant of the council as well. And I have lived experience of ASB and also living experience through the whole process. But my question is relating to why is there no vulnerable policy or strategy in line with the Spotlight report on attitude, respect and rights that are co-produced with the residents and victims of ASB? If there is one, where is it and when was it published and when was it allocated, and why does it not apply to all ASB resident victims?
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Yes, Mr. Catt, I think you want to come and speak to the Task and Finish group at some point, don't you? Yeah, so it's great to meet you today. So thank you for your question. Having engaged with officers from the Housing Department, I have received the following response. It says, we recognise the importance of ensuring that our housing services are inclusive, respectful and responsive to the needs of residents, particularly those who are vulnerable. While there is currently no standalone vulnerability policy or reasonable adjustment policy in place, I can confirm that work is actively underway to address this as part of a wider programme of policy development, which has so far included a new antisocial behaviour policy and hate incident policy, which, by the way, I have seen now. The vulnerability policy will set out our approach to adapting service provision to meet the individual needs of residents. It will be informed by equalities data and lived experience and will reflect our commitment to recognising the unique experiences of each individual and tailoring support accordingly, collaborating across departments and with external agencies, including social services, health, education, and the voluntary sector. Using evidence-based approaches to guide decisions and interventions. We are aiming to begin consultation with council tenants, leaseholders, residents in temporary accommodation, and those accessing our homelessness and housing options service early in the new year to ensure the policy is co-produced and reflects the voices of those it is designed to support. So that gives you some idea of timeline. So do you have a supplementary question, Mr. Cat?
Sort of. Will that include that the staff members of the Brighton Hove City Council will also be approached and trained regarding their attitudes in respect to the ASB victims? Because a lot of the policies that are already in place are effective, but it's the officers and individuals involved that do not uphold those policies, and also sometimes the correct procedures that affect the victims of ASB, and also in the long term affect the individuals that cause the ASB. So it needs to be a whole approach rather than just tenants. There needs to be some form of training in-house as well.
Okay, that is a very good question about whether officers have the training and whether they actually keep to the policies. And I will go to that department and ask them to provide you with a written response. But because of the task and finish group, I'll also be making sure that, that gets looked into. Because I agree with you, I think it's very important. So thank you so much, Mr. Cat, for coming here and asking your question and braving us all in this not always very hospitable place. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Councillor McClay.
Just wondering, is it confirmed now that we will have victim representation for the task and finish group?
Yeah, we will have lived experience. Yes, we will.
Will Lee be among them?
Yes, well, he has written to us already, and I have said yes.
Yeah, because I think that would be really useful.
I think it would be extremely useful. But first of all, we're going to the local authorities, then we're going to the housing associations, and then we're going to the kind of lived experience, and also probably speak to councillors as well about their experiences. So it will be quite thorough, Councillor McClay, but I think lived experience is very important for that. Okay, there are no member questions. So I'll go into my chair's comments. So today we are beginning the process of scrutinising the council's budget, as this was asked for that we did begin this process quite early. Obviously, we're not into the details yet, but it does get the ball rolling for us, which I think is very important. But we're having an update from Councillor Jacob Taylor and officers on the council's financial situation. I think it's John Hove, is it today with Jacob? John Houghton, right, sorry, thank you. As set out in the report, it would be helpful if members could limit questions to remain within the remit of this committee. So remembering what place does and what people do. We are adult social care, we are education, we are equalities. We kind of veer a little bit into place for some things, but we're obviously not going to be talking about the housing budget. Okay, so if we can remember that. And because a similar report is going to the Place Overview and Scrutiny Committee, where issues within their remit will be covered. We will then be looking at the renewal of the Section 75 Agreement on Mental Health Services, which I'm sure you'll all agree are extremely important, between the Council and Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. Before we begin, I want to make members of the committee and any speakers today as well aware that the council is still in the pre-election period ahead of the Queen's Park ward by-election on 18th of September. Therefore, I would urge members of the committee and cabinet members presenting to us to refrain from making any comments which could be seen to encourage or discourage support for any party or candidate standing in the election. So we just need to be a bit careful. Okay, thank you. So our first item is the General Fund Budget Planning and Resource Update, in which Councillor Jacob Taylor, Cabinet Member for Finance and City Regeneration, will be presenting. Jacob, would you like to present to the committee? I know you would. I know how good you are at this as well. So I look forward to it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee, for bringing this item and inviting us today to talk about it. There were two documents published as part of your agenda in addition to your overall report. There was the General Fund Budget Planning and Resource Update, which was taken to Cabinet earlier in the year, which is sort of 28 pages, and then there was a second document, an appendix, that just gave some more detailed financial tables for future years. I'll give a broad overview from my side, and then I'll try and shut up as quickly as possible so we can get into questions and discussion. But I'll give a broad overview of the position and then obviously get into questions. In terms of the position, what the General Fund update shows for coming years. If we start with the immediate year, and as you've said, we're early in the budget process in terms of budget setting. We're nowhere near having a draft budget, but we're early in the process. But we do know a decent amount into the new financial year about where the pressures are arising, and so therefore we know a little bit about what future budgets are going to look like. In terms of 26-27, you can see both in the appendix document that has 4 years going out into the future, and also you can see from section 5.1 in the main report onwards, an overview of the projected pressures for next year. And interestingly, what that is showing is our overall resource base, so our overall general fund, is actually likely to go up fairly significantly based on projections around council tax, etc. So the general fund that we have this year in the budget that we're currently operating on is 264 million. And so we're forecasting that will go up in the resources that we have to 281 million. Which is an increase of about £16 million, which is about 6.3%, which is sort of above what inflation currently is. So there is an increase in resources that follows a similar increase in the budget that we've just set. I think it went up by something like 18 million in the budget that we've just set versus the previous year. So going up in both cash and real terms when you compare to inflation overall. However, what the report sets out is that the level of pressures that are being seen within budgets, general inflationary pressures that impact the costs of the things that we do, and indeed staffing costs, as well as a number of specific service area pressures, are suggesting that the overall increased pressure for providing the same level of services next year would be an additional £56 million. When you then take into account the additional funding that we're going to get of £16 million, means that we're looking at a budget gap of around £40 million, £39.7 million for next financial year. You can see within those tables on 5.1 and then within the appendix, you can get a sense of where those pressures are coming from, and they won't be a surprise to many councillors who've been looking at these things for a number of years. And to your point, Chair, they are highly relevant to this committee because the majority of those pressures come from relevant service areas. I want to be really clear, and something that Anusri flagged in a previous meeting, probably an SFCR meeting many years ago, that when we talk about these pressures, we are not, absolutely not, blaming service users for increased pressure costs. We're just transparently saying that here are the areas where there are increased pressures which are not the fault at all of the residents accessing those services. homeless families being a prime example. It's certainly not their fault that the housing market is in such a difficult position that they're facing homelessness. But the table sets out some of the sort of key areas. The largest single one is indeed around housing, temporary accommodation and rough sleeping, both cost pressures in the underlying market, but also demand pressures in terms of number of families. We're looking at about 12 million pressure going into next year. Adult social care itself is around a £9 million pressure. And then there's some pressure within children, families and learning. There's about £1.2 million for home to school transport on its own, and then 4.6 million within the rest of that directorate, largely around placements for children in care and children with disabilities. So those taken on their own are around £25 million of pressure, which is a good chunk of that overall £40 million pressure that we're seeing going into next year. The rest of the table in the appendix shows future years, so 4 years out, and does a similar exercise. It says what is likely to be the overall resource base of the general fund, what are the pressures, and therefore what are the differences. The pressures are seen to go down versus the immediate financial year, but in cumulative effect of that, it's about £95 million of pressure over 4 years on the general fund. I think a couple of other things to point out. If we come back to the beginning of the document at 3.5, 3.5 gives us a sense of the financial sustainability overall of the authority. And this is a graph that John and team put together, something that I'd asked for. And that graph effectively compares us to other unitary authorities in the country and looks at our reserve base, so our general reserve or a working balance, and then compares it to the overall size of authorities. And what that shows is that comparatively we have a very, very low working balance. Taking your guidance, Chair, with the by-election, we won't mention any politics at all, but we had an overspend previously which drew down that working balance. Arguably, and as John sets out in the report, that working balance, even if it wasn't drawn down, was probably a bit low versus other authorities in the country. We should probably be thinking around a £12 million or £15 million general reserve, which when you compare to the overall budgets of the council, gross budget of the entire council, when you think about DSG and housing revenue account, is £1 billion, right? The net general fund is more like 260, 280 as we're talking about. Having a general reserve of 10 or 15 million pounds really isn't overly prudent at all. And obviously, if you're running a big charity or a business, you'd be thinking about having cash in the bank to be able to manage operations and unforeseen events. So we do have very low reserves. I just want us to reiterate that point. For whatever reason, we have low reserves, which puts us in a tricky position. The authority overall has had a generally fairly good record for 20 years in setting a budget and then coming in roughly on budget, which has meant we haven't had to draw down those reserves. But it does put us in a tricky position when you've got big budget deficits you're setting each year, savings programs, difficult to achieve sometimes, and you've got those relatively low level of reserves. In terms of the in-year position, what has been published so far is TBM2 has been publicly published, and then there will be a further TBM at some point. It sets it out in the report, but that initial TBM showed a forecast risk of about £15 million for this year's budget, which is a relatively high level. Previous administrations of different colours have ended up coming in on budget for the year, faced with a forecast risk of that level, but it is relatively high. And to be honest, it's driven by the same things that we've just talked about that are contributing to the future year budget deficit and risk, particularly pressures around temporary accommodation and homelessness. So that's an overview of the general budget position that we're facing. We're very early on in the process. We also don't know what we're getting in terms of settlement from the government. They've got a consultation at the moment about fair funding review, but we don't yet know what that settlement will be. It's quite complicated in terms of the ways they're changing the formulas. And so what ends up happening post the consultation, we will have to see likely at some point in the autumn, which will give us our final position upon which we set a budget. We are already, as Cabinet and leadership team, starting to draw up possible proposals for budget setting for next year, and clearly further on in the process, as and when is appropriate, we'll come to this committee when we've got draft proposals to look at. I would say overall this year we are in a very tricky position. Officers are working really, really hard to try and mitigate some of those pressures that we're seeing in the year. We're pushing as councillors on the Cabinet side to think outside the box a bit, particularly on temporary accommodation, and think about some more radical options using the council's balance sheet. A big driver of these costs are spot purchased temporary accommodation from the private sector. And so should we be thinking about using the council's resources to buy some of that accommodation and bring more temporary accommodation in-house? I'm certainly in favour of it if we can get the finances to stack up. The financing costs of buying such a thing, could those costs be less than the actual price of procuring it? And also trying to control the market a little bit. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at in year, as well as a number of other options to try and mitigate those financial risks, while of course keeping at the heart of what we do that the people accessing these services need these services, are entitled to these services, and we've got to continue providing them, but try and provide them in the most cost efficient way to the council. I don't know whether, John, there was anything you wanted to add from an overview.
No, I think you've covered it in detail. I don't think there's really anything else to say. As you've mentioned, we're relatively early in the budget process for this year, so we'll come back to this committee later in the year when we have a set of draft proposals that we're starting to take through. I think a couple of things I was going to say. So when we come to those proposals later on in the year, we won't just be looking at the next financial year, 26-27, we'll want to be looking 4 years out. I think it's really important that we set a longer term financial strategy. And to Jacob's point in terms of some of the things that we can do, actually things like temporary accommodation, a programme of expanding the access to temporary accommodation that we have as a council rather than spot purchasing is really, really important financially. It's also something that will take us time to develop. So actually it will hopefully achieve savings in the short term. It will also achieve savings in the medium term as well. So yeah, we're certainly looking at that. And our overall approach, I mean, the only thing I really want to say, our overall approach in terms of budget setting, so whilst we're still working up the detail, is very much about how can we look at managing the demand for some of our services. So alongside what we've talked about around things like temporary accommodation and housing, are there things that we can do? Let's say in adult social care, we may be able to look what we can do in preventative terms around things like reablement. So what are some of the investments that we can make that might actually reduce the long-term costs of our care? In children's social care, for example, there's quite a lot of work going on across the southeast in terms of councils working together to be able to increase the supply of children's placements, which decreases the reliance, for example, on a really, really expensive market in terms of children's social care. So there are those sorts of things that we're looking at in terms of how we can reduce the long-term cost of our services. And we're also looking as well at sort of how we transform the way the council works. So how can we invest in IT and digital? What are the sort of things that we can do that reduce our operational costs? And as well as part of that, how can we increase the efficiency of the council? We're also looking at our property assets as well. So what are the things that we can do in terms of actually being more efficient in terms of our use of property? Because actually we spend quite a lot on the maintenance and upkeep of our property. So are there things that we can do differently there? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we all found that extremely helpful and illuminating. It's always scary, those big numbers as well. I have to say, over the years, I've got more used to these budgets, but they can be sort of quite overwhelming. I just wanted to say at the beginning, I'm delighted that there is this move to bring more things in-house and to work with other local authorities. I think that is a very major step that needs to be taken and should save us money, because the costs to pay for other providers are astronomical. And I'm hoping as well that we will be looking at something for home to school transport, which is another big sort of, it's kind of like a money pit, really, essentially. So I think those are all brilliant things that we're hearing about. I will throw a kind of thing in because I was at a fire authority seminar this morning, and inevitably that wonderful subject devolution came up, which comes up in place, but in the end it will come to us as well because it is going to affect adult social care, children's services and so on. And inevitably it will affect the budgetary process, I would imagine, in the future. So that's a kind of unknown thing for us, I think, at the moment, but one which we should perhaps have, in our minds, that this is a very fluid situation. There's a lot of change coming our way. And so I think we all need to be pretty sharp about it. So after having said that, and thank you very much indeed, that was very clear presentation and very helpful. So I'm now going to go to our members who I am absolutely sure will have lots of questions. And I'm just finding a nice blank piece of paper to write names down. I've got Josh, okay, Josh, and I've got Councillor McClay, I've got Cattell, okay, I've got Adam, and I've got Sarah, sorry. And sorry, Sue. Sorry, Sue. Well, you know that I try and be fair and go from, I don't do all Labour and all Greens or whatever. And thank you, Anne. I try and make it Anna 3. That's great. And I think because I think this is very important for the private. Can you shout your name again, because I can't see from here and I haven't got it. Jessica Sumner. That's it. Very important that we have representation from the voluntary sector, because obviously they have huge interest in the budget, because they kind of depend on it, and what their slice of it will be. So I will go to Josh first, and then I'm going to go to Councillor McClay, and then I will go to Adam. Okay, so those will be my first three. So Josh, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, so it's just a question for Jacob. So it's just looking at 3.5 in terms of the reserves, and obviously, you pointed out it effectively looks like we're in the relegation zone for councils in terms of the reserves. So I was just wondering, in terms of getting that up, up the chart, what are we looking for? Are we looking for the medium in terms of councils of the same size, and over what kind of period are you trying to kind of build up the reserves? Given we've also got we've got a substantial amount of cuts that we've got to make. So I suppose it's that balance, that's I'm getting at.
We might get a different answer between John or I, because I think John, as CFO, will probably give his sort of pure professional opinion. And obviously, getting there has consequences, right? Because paying back a reserve, it means something that you wouldn't be able to use even on a one-off basis or on an ongoing basis in terms of general fund. I think John thinks of it in the sort of 15 million or 12 million range would be more prudent. That would be slightly higher than what was the previous assumption. The assumption for a long time had been 9 million. And interestingly, that 9 million didn't change, I don't think, for something like over 10 years, through which obviously you had inflation and you had our general fund going up, fairly significantly. And so we have to get back to 9 million and then raise it. I mean, John, what do you think? 15 million over 4 years to get to, or something like that?
Yeah, I think so broadly. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you've just said. I think time has moved on, and therefore when I'm coming in looking at it, thinking a sort of a figure around 12 to 15 million would feel appropriate for the size of our budget and some of the risks that we've been describing. I think the report sort of sets out maybe a kind of a sort of 3 to 4 year time frame up to about sort of March 2029. It is unrealistic to be able to do that immediately. The council, in setting its budget this year, has set aside, made an assumption that there will be a contribution back to reserves over the next couple of years. So that is baked into the budget, and therefore that should be achievable over a 3 to 4 year period. The challenge with all of this is obviously then you have in-year cost pressures, and actually part of the reason you set aside reserves is to manage unexpected pressures. I would hope that we can achieve that in a 3 to 4 year period. Obviously, that is notwithstanding any kind of cost pressures that happen in the year that we might have to manage. But yeah, I think a 3 to 4 year period.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chair. So a couple of things. So on temporary accommodation, the cost is doubling, and it's kind of each year. And I imagine the following year you're looking at a similar kind of increase unless these prevention mechanisms work. So I'm wondering what's being done. This is a national issue. It's not just here. So what's being done in terms of representation to address and manage this nationally? Picking up on the point of adult social care and looking at it in terms of prevention as an opportunity, if it's also being underfunded, is it realistic to think that that area is somewhere that will have the bandwidth to be able to help with prevention? Also picking up on our chair's comment on home to school transport, being a bit of a money pit, where we have SEND being a particular sticking point for the recent school allocations decision. A major issue for parents on that decision was their concern around SEND, the impact for them. And I think one of the kind of resolutions for that or solutions for that would have been, transport will be provided. So will demand go up based on that recent decision? And finally, business rates, something that I'm hearing a lot about in the North Lane. A lot of the small independent businesses are talking about their concerns there. We've already seen the drop in the relief of business rates. That is really impacting those small businesses. So I'm quite concerned about the fair funding review and the business rate reset, what that's going to mean for business rates going forward. Because if we look at the fallout from that in terms of our communities, we're already seeing that these businesses are looking at a rise in rents, their produce and ingredients going up, rents going up. They're really feeling that pressure. So do we start to see the closing down of businesses, empty units, a rise in antisocial behaviour? And that's some of the sentiment that I'm hearing in the North Lane.
Thank you, Councillor McLean.
So first question, what's being done nationally on TA? Well, I mean, the first thing to do, stepping back, is to say, well, how do we get out of this crisis that we're in nationally? But you're right, it's national, but it's particularly acute in the southeast and particularly acute in this city. How do we get out of it? We get out of it by fixing our housing market. And the only way we can fix our housing market is to build more houses, but particularly build more social and affordable houses, which is why one of the things I was most pleased with in the budgets and the financial decisions that the government have made so far is the doubling of the overall capital amount for social and affordable housing to 39 billion. Speaking to colleagues in the housing sector, it was more than some people had expected. I think that was a great win of the now departed Deputy Prime Minister in terms of securing that amount of money. And we will be and are, via officers and the projects that we're identifying, bidding for that money to build as many affordable homes as we can in the city. If you're going to use public money, you want to be using that to build proper long-term units for social housing to get families off the waiting list and into social housing, and by the way, in some cases out of temporary accommodation and into social housing. So that's the first thing that we need to continue lobbying on nationally. I think the government have made a good first step in that, in terms of really focusing on building social and affordable. One of the things we've got to do locally is make the pitch for get the funding into the areas with the most acute housing crises, because actually what can happen, and this is not a party political point of all governments, if you want to hit numbers, it's cheaper to build in other areas of the country. But if you want to really tackle areas that have acute housing crisis, you're better off building where the high demand is, and the high demand is in places like Brighton and Hove. Other things we could make the case for, although whether we even need to make the case nationally, in theory could be within our remit, is if you can make the financial case stack up to actually buy temporary accommodation units, either existing units that are being used or other units just in terms of buying it straight off the market, and if the financing costs of that are less than the cost of what it would be to spot purchase, that's the sort of thing that we're looking at. As you'll be aware, Councillor McClay, the council has a housing buyback programme. We buy something like 60 to 100 houses per year in the private sector. A lot of them former council properties that have been sold off under right to buy and now HMOs. We buy those back. It may be that some of those could be accelerated, but go to temporary accommodation for some period, or maybe they're social housing, and maybe we think about direct offers, which was covered in the housing strategy and the allocations policy, as a way of getting some of those families that are stuck in temporary accommodation into settled accommodation more quickly. So those are the kinds of things that we have to do. But the overarching one is you've got to fix the broken housing market that is so acute in Brighton and Hove. But to reassure, we are constantly lobbying ministers both on individual schemes that we want to try and bring forward, but the overall picture of spending more money on affordable and social. In terms of prevention, look, most of the public sector is in a difficult financial position given what's happened in previous years and in the inheritance. The government is spending a lot more money investing in public services. The amount of money that was increased in the first budget for the NHS was huge. Off the top of my head, something like 30 billion or something like that. It was a big increase, real terms increase in NHS funding. That doesn't mean that individual trusts and individual parts of the NHS are not struggling with budgets. And Councillor Gage will probably give a better answer than this than I could. But my understanding is the government are particularly focused on prevention. They talk about prevention a lot. We've got to obviously do the piece of linking up the council with the NHS. And there's the next item on the agenda is looking at that kind of thing to try and do preventative work and try and invest to save on preventative. So yeah, the overall position of the NHS is still difficult, but the government are putting in much more money. And it's about how you allocate resources, isn't it? Do you have to take some decisions to refocus money on preventative, which you know then in the long term will start to help and bring things down. In terms of home to school transport, the interesting thing on home to school transport is it's a very big number, but actually we don't benchmark too bad at all. The counties, Surrey, East Sussex, West Sussex, would love to have our per head cost of home to school transport. Because we're a small city, we obviously have some out of city placements, and that's where the cost tends to go up a bit. But actually, we don't benchmark too bad at all. We're below average. That said, it's a big overall number, and I know the service are looking at, they're always looking at, what's the best way to procure that service. The children that get that service are absolutely entitled to the service, but how's the best way, most efficient way to procure it? Also cognizant that a previous attempt to look at home to school transport went fairly wrong. And I think the service are very cognizant of not rushing through something that might save you money on paper, but totally screw up the procurement and end up costing you more money. And clearly, it's a user group where you can't take a lot of risks because these are vulnerable children and they deserve that service. So the service are working through it carefully, but actually we don't benchmark too bad. In terms of send impact on the school admissions, obviously something we've talked about before, Councillor McClay, we also have to distinguish between the home to school transport policy, which also includes eligibility for bus pass transport, and those children that are eligible for individual home to school transport via minibus or taxi because it's named in their EHCP. It wouldn't really follow that changes in school admissions would necessarily increase the latter. What we are going to be doing imminently is reviewing the overall home to school transport policy, including the bus pass eligibility, because if it's implied that there may be some longer journeys within the school admissions as a result of school admissions, then clearly we then need to look at the bus pass eligibility and can we tweak that eligibility. I personally would like all bus travel to be free for anyone under 16. I think that would be a good thing for the city and for society. At the moment, that would be expensive with the bus company, but there may be things that we can incrementally do. And by the way, we also have subsidies within our bus network. Some of the school routes are subsidised school routes. So we need to look at that in the round, which is to say if there are flows dropping off, we because of pupil numbers and demographics, we may not need to subsidise some routes, but we may be able to put some of that money into bus pass eligibility. But that is upcoming in terms of a piece of work. Business rates, look, I totally understand what you're saying. We've had a meeting that you kindly arranged with some of those businesses, and I understand the pressures that businesses are under. We obviously don't set business rates, that's nationally set. That relief that was in place was obviously temporary relief, and it has now gone away, and that has been an increase for some businesses. I mean, overall, and this is not to dismiss the costs faced by business at all, we understand that entirely. Overall, we're in a reasonably lucky position in Brighton and Hove in that we have a relatively buoyant retail sector overall. When you look at vacancies in retail units, we have some of the lowest vacancies in the entire country. We have quite high churn because people start businesses and they unfortunately don't succeed, and the new ones come in relatively rapidly because we have a fairly buoyant retail sector and tourist sector. So I'm not saying at all that business rates is not an issue, but we also have to remember that the city's in a pretty good position in terms of vacancies and small businesses starting up. We're trying to support as best we can as a council those small businesses in the city. We can't obviously control business rates, as I said, but there are other things we can do to help them, support them. Overall, one of the things that we can do is make sure that the city operates well, particularly in the city centre, in terms of things like refuse recycling, cleaner streets, helping work with the police to tackle antisocial behaviour so that the city centre is a inviting place for visitors to come to. So we've got to do all those things to help support business. But business rates, yeah, obviously we don't directly control, but I totally understand that it's a concern for businesses overall.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just as a little add-on to what Councillor McLeay said, at the moment regarding, homeless people and having to provide accommodation, at the moment, I know from estate agents that the market is awash with flats because a lot of landlords are selling up because they want to get out before the renters reform comes in. Does that provide any opportunities for the council, or are we stuck because we don't have enough money to buy them? I just thought I'd ask that.
It's a very good question. It absolutely does provide opportunities, but don't tell them. Don't let anyone know outside of this meeting, because then they'll put their prices up. That's a joke. You're absolutely right. The market is fairly wobbly at the moment in terms of there are more sellers than buyers at the moment in the city. As you say, some landlords are vacating the market. My view is very much that we as the council landlord should absolutely step in, take advantage of that wobble in the market and buy as many as we possibly can, both for housing revenue account and potentially temporary accommodation. So yes, and does the council, yeah, I mean, obviously the council isn't awash with money. We don't have an unlimited balance sheet. But one interesting thing that perhaps isn't in the paper is actually in terms of overall debt, the council actually is below average versus unitary authorities in the country in terms of our overall levels of borrowing versus our general fund, which suggests that, yes, we can't go and splurge billions, but there is some scope there to borrow some more money to do exactly that kind of thing, intervene in the market, purchase some properties, bring down our unit cost of temporary accommodation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Taylor. I'm now going to Adam, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. I think, a couple of points and a linked question, if that's okay. And it speaks
fine.
Speaks slightly to your point, Chair, about bringing services in-house. And I think that particularly that's true that savings can be made in particular when provision is in the private sector. And I know that that's been acknowledged here in terms of how those market solutions for human care issues are, in my personal opinion, wrong. And actually the voluntary sector can play a significant part. Whilst it's true that Brighton and Hove City Council is a significant and strategic customer of voluntary sector services, there are massive benefits before us in terms of working, collaborating on services that can be delivered, of course, particularly in our ability to leverage other money and national funding for Brighton and Hove. One example of that is the Climate Action Project that a group of charities in the city have been able to win £1.3 million for the city through the lottery, and in fact subcommissioned the local authority to deliver as part of that, making sure that youth and children's engagement through schools on the environmental issue is subsidised and affordable in the coming years. So we're really excited about that work, and as an example of how charities will and can work and bring extra resource in. My linked point was about how I had a recent meeting with senior manager in the civil service who's in charge of public service team, lives in Lewis, which is nice. And he's in charge of the social outcomes partnership and a new fund that's coming called the Better Futures Fund. There's £500 million sat in a dormant asset fund, unspent money in bank accounts and things. And we are excited about the prospect of building vehicles for bringing some of that money in terms of social impact investment, social impact bonds and things. The fact that the local authority has some resource put aside for spend to save means that there's a natural match to bring in and leverage lots of resource. And there are quite a lot of skills being developed in the voluntary sector for building these vehicles, for bringing that money in, because it won't just come as a matter of course as a grants program, for instance. So we're really excited about that strategic level, particularly where there could be, solutions here for these massive costs in housing and things. And well, that was my question. Would you be in a position to outline the principles that will guide you as you make savings going forwards, based on priorities that are coming up through council services around, for instance, prevention spending over crisis spending and those sorts of things? And are those available to see publicly? Thank you.
Do you want to say? Well, yeah, we can follow up on that Better Futures Fund. We can check with officers whether they're already sort of working on that and looking at, but absolutely would be keen for the council to work with the voluntary sector if there's ways to unlock that funding. And as you say, often the CVS sector is better at accessing external things than the council will be. So very keen to look at that. I mean, in terms of the overall principles, that will obviously be for Cabinet and then full council for everyone to debate and agree on the actual specifics of a budget. But, the way that I think about it is we have a huge duty as a council to continue providing the best type of customer and client and public facing services that we can across the range of different things that the council does. The most important things that the council do are protect people, protect vulnerable children. I always say the most important thing that we do is our children's social work team, because if you get that wrong, there are consequences beyond our imagination in terms of how bad things can get. We have to continue providing the best type of services that we can to the public, but we have to start doing it and continue doing it in the smartest way possible. And so that's why there's a heavy emphasis in the report and everything we're thinking about in Invest to Save. Invest for the preventative bit if we can, invest in technology and systems to make things more efficient so that the front end product and service that can be provided remains the same where possible, but it's done in a more efficient way in the background. I mean, anyone who accesses council services will know that we're not yet perfect, are we, in the way that we issue parking permits or the way that we process necessarily council tax or any other number of front-facing services. If we can improve our systems and do that better and easier, there will be cost savings, but still providing the same frontline services. And we also have to try and protect the universal services, which is the tricky bit. That's the bit that many councils all across the country have ended up having to cut over the last 15 years, is because you've got statutory duties on the care side. The other bits that are universal often are not statutory. So toilet provision, you probably have to have some toilets, but there's no statutory provision to have a certain number. Parks, litter, graffiti, all of that stuff is the stuff that's easy to say, well, we're not going to do as much of that anymore. And that's what we've seen nationwide. We're trying to obviously maintain that as well, because that's a really important part of what local democracy is and why there is so little faith in local democracy across the country, because people think, oh, why can't the councils get these basics right? So it's really important that we try and do both. But the starting point, as you sort of implied, Adam, is how can you do it with Invest to Save, with transformation, so that you're doing providing the same level of service, but trying to manage the cost in the background, and then do the preventative bit, which effectively manages the demand.
Yeah. Any follow-up? Were you happy with that, Adam? Okay, thank you very much. I now go to Councillor Cattell.
Thank you, Chair. Jacob, as you know, there's a sum of around £4 million from Section 106 allocations for capital projects in the education budget. Now, in my role as lead, my lead role overseeing Section 106 and SIL, I've been trying for at least a year, if not more, to find out how this money could be spent in order to offset the pressure on the school's budget. And I have got a meeting later this week about that with the budget holder. But is it, I don't know what's going to happen at that meeting, but what I'm wondering is if we could speed up the process for allocating this money, it might help to close a tiny bit of the budget gap. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on that and how we could perhaps, put a bit of pressure on the budget holder. Thank you.
I think my overall thoughts, but other councillors can give their views, is that historically, Section 106 and now what is becoming SIL has been a little bit of a black box, perhaps away from members, and we're trying to change that very much. And I think we are changing that. It's taking slow process. But the important bit there is that one, there's obviously democracy and accountability. The councillors need to have oversight of those funds, and we've obviously got the neighbourhood SIL amounts coming up that will be, I think, really important for wards to get involved in, communities to get involved in for bidding. But it also matters corporately and strategically for the council in that if you've got these sums of capital, clearly the Section 106 agreements allocate them to certain things and areas of spend, but you've got to use that strategically to, yes, build new things where we can and where they're needed in communities, but also, supporting existing pressures on whether it's school buildings, etc., or other facilities that are in decline. We've been pushing very much. I think in the next year, we will have a much more transparent view of 106 and SIL amounts for all councillors and the administration to be able to allocate strategically, and obviously the community bits that have to be allocated to community will also. But I'll certainly keep pushing on it.
Thank you very much. And now I go to Sarah. Is it Sarah or Sarah?
Right hand one. That's it. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I often think that the way to make budgets do what they're meant to do is seen as cut. So I welcome the idea of anything more imaginative, really, especially, I'm talking for the Older People's Council. We've seen older people's services cut in terms of in-house services over the years. And in fact, in this year's budget, it was actually the older people's services and learning disability services, instead of being brought in-house in line with this administration's manifesto pledges, they were the ones that went out. So I hope an imaginative view of how to bring money in can be looked at with older people's services as well. Not always, sometimes it feels a bit like the quietist take the biggest cuts, really. So, to look at preventive services and actually, is there a way, like you were saying, that, sometimes buying from the private sector is at an astronomical price, that actually could we bring those private payers in-house for older people's services as well? And as I say, look more imaginatively about how we bring money in rather than just cut. One thing that I've often wondered, and it's not specifically an older people's thing, but I mean, we have an awful lot of multi-occupancy landlords. And when talking about small businesses, I'm thinking a lot of them are student landlords. Students don't pay council tax. Do those landlords pay business tax? And is there any reason why not, if they don't? Why?
To that specific question, we might have to write to you with a fuller answer, but I think it depends on the nature of the business. I think big landlords that have multiple properties probably do pay business rates, but if they're a sole operator and just having one property, then they may not pay business rates. But we can write to you or write to the committee with the sort of breakdown of how that works in practice in the city.
I was going to come in, if it's okay, just in terms of the point, in terms of sort of social care and placements and private sector and bringing things in house. I mean, I think, just purely from my point of view, I think different markets are different. I think I wouldn't want to be sort of as simplistic as to say if we were to bring everything from the private sector into the council, it would inevitably cost less and would be cheaper. I mean, what we see in children's social care is we see placement, hugely expensive placements from a market that knows that local authorities don't have the supply and can kind of name their price, and that is hugely expensive. And councils across, as I say, across the southeast, we're part of the regional care cooperative, are looking at how we can kind of manage that market. And in terms of temporary accommodation as well, some private businesses know that councils urgently need that accommodation and can sort of name their price, and we pay an awful lot. So increasing the supply there is really important. I think it is worth saying, just to sort of manage expectations, that there are many private providers, voluntary sector providers who will provide care at reasonable rates, and so it would be simplistic of me to say actually if we would bring everything in, it would inevitably cost less, because it's more complicated than that. You have to look at it on a sector by sector basis, and actually on an individual provider basis would be my view, and I just want to be clear about that.
I mean, and I was going to say, I was going to say, well, I'm not ideological about it. Well, actually, I am ideological about it in that I would like all public services to be in-house within the public sector and have as little private provision as possible. However, in the seat as finance lead and thinking about the council, as John says, we do have to look at it on a sort of case-by-case basis. We have brought some things in-house, right? I mean, we brought in-house the provision at Island Lodge, which is now called Rainbow Lodge, which has had 3 children. That has achieved both a saving, but is also bringing a service effectively in-house and within the city. Housing repairs are brought in-house a number of years ago under previous administration. Obviously, there were some bumps, but we now think that overall that is a better service in-house. Within the adults market, the vast majority of the adults market, as you know, Sarah, nationally, is not in-house at councils. We have some in-house at councils, and it's not about saying it'll always be better in-house or outsourced. It's about looking at a particular individual market. As I say, we have brought some things in-house already, but you've got to look at that overall provision. The only other thing to say on adults is, obviously, when we talk about savings and cuts, one of the big savings, or one of the big ways that we tried to reduce cost in last year's budget, was actually saying that we're not going to agree to the largely private sector uplift in fees that we were seeing every year in the adult social care market. I mean, that was by far the largest way of trying to save money, was to say, well, we're not going to agree to 6-7%. We're going to have to set that at a lower percentage. Now, I know that has an impact on those businesses, but that was a decision that was taken and has largely, so far in our TBM, been borne out, that we have been able to agree lower uplifts in prices from the private sector, and that has been a way of trying to manage those costs. So it's not always about cuts or savings, it's about a way trying to manage costs, including in the private sector.
Thank you. Yes.
Is it possible to come back just a tiny bit? I mean, yes, we did bring Rainbow Lodge in-house for children's services, but they were set up as older people's services, and we shouldn't be pitching generation against generation or vulnerable people against vulnerable people, but we lost older people's resource in order to do that. And that thing about, the private sector can command their price if in-house services don't exist, I think is being seen a lot in older people's services. I'd like to ask a question of how often the council is paying over its agreed amount to the private sector for care home placements. And I think it's a very high percentage, but I'd like to have some clarification of that. But it's just to make that point to just please remember bringing money in and not externalising everything for older people all the time still.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, and I don't quite agree on the comment on Rainbow Lodge, actually. It certainly wasn't pitting the services or generations against each other. I mean, those beds were empty in that part of the building, and it's incumbent upon councils to think about their assets and how you use your assets and how you provide services. So a part of that building currently didn't at that point have service users in those beds. So you could say, oh, well, should we just sell off that bit of the building and take the capital receipt? Or could we do something relatively innovative, which is to try and bring children back to the city and provide that service to children with very, very complex needs? I'm rather proud that we did that, and we've got children who were previously outside of the city now in the city, and it meant that were paying less for out of city placement. So I don't agree that was necessarily pitting one service user against each other. I think it was using a building that we had in an innovative way that was right for those children. In terms of paying over on individual contracts, I think we'd have to get Jeanette to revert with any numbers on that. So the question, just to be clear, is where you've already commissioned a place, the cost then overrunning the amount that's been agreed?
Sorry, how often do we commission placements in care homes for older people that are above the agreed rate that the council does? Because I think what's happening is that you're having to pay more because there is no alternative and the private sector can command their price. And I believe that that is the reason that those additional beds at Island Lodge were built very recently, was because there were not enough dementia places in the city. That changes, and people, you know, when I remember maybe 10 years ago, were being sent out to Bognor and all over the place because there was nothing for them in the city. So they were actually very recently built.
Thank you.
We'll take that as an action and revert. We have to get that from Jeanette.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you for putting forward that question, Sarah. Okay, I am now going to go to Sue. Sue Shank.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think it's good to have a bit of a look at the budget, but it's not the budget yet. And I think, you know, it feels a bit like we know this. Well, I've been here quite a long time, longer than most of you probably, and every budget, because when I was first to council was 2011, so just after austerity hit. Previous to that, I did work in local government, which was much better funded, and I did have expectations that we might see a better, you know, future for local government. It still feels a bit like we're being made to, you know, impose austerity on our residents, and no solution to adult social care funding, you know, which has been promised several times. I know that's nothing we can do about locally, but I think, you know, we're still going from, you know, one crisis to another in a way, constantly trying to do what we, you know, trying to save money in various ways, as I just said. So while I'm pleased that, you know, we might be able to do some of the things you're talking about, I think really the crisis is a bigger one in terms of the relationship of central government to local government. While central government, you know, we're an arm of government, and you know, services like the service that I've been most concerned with in youth services, for example, is almost completely gone throughout the country because of local government having to cut a cloth which is set by national government. We're not even able to set actually our own council tax rates, etc. So that's a bit of a rant. I think my main concern about, I mean, also now it's having to do local government reform, and that doesn't feel as though it's been, you know, the BBC even said it's not really being looked at properly in terms of how much is actually going to cost individual councils or the country as a whole. You know, both types of the local government reorganisation particularly. I know we're going to be debating that at some other stage. I would, you know, I think it would be a good time to knock that on the head personally, because we've got change of people who have started it and for some reason, you know, it's been gone along with, but
it's not going to, I think that's going to have a bigger impact on our budget than we thought it would. My main concern, I suppose, is about the timing of any consultation, because I know, like in the voluntary sector, for example, people are really not sure what's going to happen to their budgets. And last year, it was very short notice. And I think it has been in previous years on all administrations tried to be done earlier. And a proper discussion, not just like, oh, we're going to cut this, what do you think? But actually a bit more like we're trying to do here, but in a more informal way. Because I think, the community and voluntary sector will just see that actually they're not going to get an increase. No, they're really struggling because, okay, they've had their grants to a certain extent protected, but they're not covering what they need to cover in terms of inflation, etc. So, there's been a standstill on those, and I think it needs to come early. So if I was going to try and make a recommendation out of this, it would be that we need to see something a bit more bit more structured about what is actually being proposed, certainly before the end of the year, and to have those conversations with the voluntary sector and with opposition councillors and residents. Because otherwise it just ends up people campaign against, like they're doing with libraries at the moment, campaign against the closure, instead of actually people being able to say, well, what we really need to do is this or that. So I think I would just like to see the timetable for this, because at the moment we used to bring something to P&R in December always, and that would be the beginning then of a proper, this is what we're proposing. So I'd like to just try and see if you can send us a timetable earlier and what your consultation is going to be with people impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Can you turn off your microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, just in terms of the first section, which I know wasn't a question, but just sort of briefly respond. I mean, in terms of crisis and getting out of the crisis, I mean, my view is that effectively advanced economies, and the UK included, have been in a crisis since the financial crisis of 2008 that we haven't really shifted out of in terms of pattern and necessarily shifted to a new mode. I would return to the actual figures, though, which is, I know it feels like we have to be looking at savings to close budget gaps, but the budgets are going up. As I said, the budget went up last year by quite a significant amount, 18 million of a general fund of 250 million. So it was both the real terms and cash increase last year. Now, would I like it to be 100 million increase? Yeah, sure. That would make my job very much easier. But we had the big increase last year, and even in this difficult forecast for next year, in cash terms and real terms, it is going up. So the government is trying to rectify the issues with local government, and the government does believe in local government. Previous local government minister Jim McMahon was from local government and had run a council. Steve Reed, who's now the overall Secretary of State, previously ran a council, I think it was Croydon, and they do very much believe in local government, and they believe in local government because they know that local government provides the services that most people interact with on a day-to-day basis. And they also understand that local government has the power, if they're funded, to be able to transform things locally and do the kind of preventative work that they want to do. I think devolution, which was mentioned earlier, in my opinion, is only a good thing and will mean more money for the region, which will have a knock-on impact on local authorities, because if there's more money in the region doing things like investing in skills, investing in back to work, investing in transport infrastructure, investing in economic development, that will help local authorities in a number of ways, reducing their costs, but also boosting revenues from things like business rates and council tax and parking fees and whatever else. So I think devolution will be important. LGR, obviously, as you say, for some people it's contentious. Let's see what gets proposed, and we're going to debate that in future weeks. In terms of the timing, I mean, I basically agree with you. We'd like to bring it as early as possible. In both years that I've been involved in setting budgets, we got our settlement very late in the year, and we only got 1 year settlements. The government have already said that they're going to do longer term settlements. I believe when we get the settlement in autumn, that will be a 3 year settlement. So that will significantly help for future budget setting years, and you will basically know your resource base from the beginning of the financial year. Clearly your pressures may change, but you'll much earlier in the year have an idea of what budget you can set. This year, we don't know exactly when it will get published. It will be some point in the autumn. I guess the difficult bit that we have is, if you were to bring a draft budget before you know what your settlement is, to an extent you're guessing, and it may end up being that you don't have to make anywhere near a level of savings that you end up having to. And so do you want to bring a set of savings that you don't actually end up having to make and put the voluntary sector and the staff through the worry of a draft budget that may not even be required? So there is that balancing act of waiting for the final settlement. But as I say, the 3-year settlement will fix the issue of not knowing early enough, and we will be able to bring budgets earlier. But I would say I want to bring a budget as early as possible so we can do the detailed scrutiny as early as possible, and that's what we'll be striving to do, dependent on when we get our settlement from government.
Thank you very much, Councillor Taylor. After Sue, it's Councillor Meadows.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering about the devolution and local reorganisation costs, because any good planning would put something aside and then you could use it to either be put against your savings if you don't use it or not. Now, I was wondering what impact that would have on future budgets, because it won't be just this year, but I'm pretty sure it may follow on to the following year in that budget as well. Because I was a bit, when you said about the autumn 3-year settlement, welcome that. That would enable good planning. But I am a little worried about the government's intention to redistribute the wealth and take it from the south and local councils down here to fund up north. So I am a little worried about that, and I'll be looking forward to seeing that 3-year budget. The other thing I was a bit confused about, it's on page 145, I think it is. It's on the appendix 1. There's a table talking about core planning assumptions. And at the bottom it says, included the introduction of second homes premium, which is equivalent to a 0.9% increase in the tax base. Is that on each of these columns above? I just wasn't sure whether it was just the 0.9%, which equates to about £1 million. Is that what you're hoping to get from second homes, or is it on all those pay, inflation, resources? Is it added onto those at all? Because I was a bit confused about that bit. And I just wondered if Angela Rayner had been giving you some tips on savings.
No party political today.
It's not local council stuff. It's not local election.
It would be amusing and tempting to make John answer that question. I'll answer the straighter questions first, which in terms of that table, so that 0.9% increase in the tax base, that relates only to the tax base row, and that's saying that in this financial year, that overall 1.5% increase in our tax base, 0.9% comes from the second home premium, and in future years it's accounted for, so it's not impacting any of the other rows within that table. The first point on overall settlements and the government's overall approach, I would disagree slightly that what the government are looking to do is distribute away from the south to the north. What they're trying to do within their formula is focus funding on deprivation. And there is deprivation in the south and there is affluence in the north. There's some very affluent places in the north of England, in parts of Yorkshire, etc. And there's some very deprived places in the south of England, along the coast. We don't know exactly how Brighton is going to fare. We probably won't get an uptick in funding, because when you look at deprivation metrics overall as a city, we're generally about mid-table versus the rest of the country, in that we know we've got high levels of deprivation in some areas and we have high levels of affluence. That obviously compares to some cities where there's just very high levels of deprivation, not much affluence. So we're not likely to get big boosting in funding from that overall. But I don't agree it's about north to south at all. There will be southern councils in deprived areas that will end up getting more funding targeted to deprivation, which is absolutely right. Obviously, overall, we'd like funding to go up overall. What was the question on Angela Rayner? Any tips? I've learned a lot from Angela Rayner in terms of her career, and I could only aspire to the success that she's had from going from a council estate teenage mum to Deputy Prime Minister. I think it's a great shame that she is no longer Deputy Prime Minister, and I think she's a credit to the Labour movement, albeit she has admitted wrongdoing and the tax basis and the advice in which she paid an amount of stamp duty, which she is now going to correct. But I certainly learned lessons from Angela Rayner. I think she's a great person, and a shame that she's not in government anymore.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councilman, if you want to come back on any of that? You're fine. Okay. I'm now going to go to Anna Sri.
Thank you,
And
Chair.
then it's you, Jessica.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for your detailed paper. John, you mentioned a reablement as a mitigation for disproportionate impact of some of those who require council services the most. And I was curious to learn more about the mitigating considerations under funding pressures. And appreciate you'll be conducting quality impact assessments, but I would like to know what the council will do about mitigating impact of planned savings on protected characteristics, especially people with care and support needs and those in insecure living, children and families in need. And I wondered if a paper could be shared with this committee to demonstrate tangible strategies to mitigate funding pressures on those protected characteristics. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Sri.
I think there's a couple of points there. I think you started by talking about reablement, and of course I'm the finance director, and so I'm not an expert in terms of service delivery. But one of the things that I think is, the director is with us, so may give you a bit of insight a little bit later on in your agenda. But one of the things that we certainly notice in terms of our adult social care and health provision in the city is that actually the number of people going through reablement is perhaps not quite as high as some of the benchmarks when you look at other areas, you look at other cities. So actually increasing the amount of reablement as people come out of hospital, for example, may improve people's quality of life, but also actually might then also reduce the amount that we would spend in terms of social care actually if those outcomes are better and reablement successful. So that's the sort of statistics that we've seen, and I think is important for us to look at throughout the budget process. Clearly, colleagues in adult social care will come back with any proposals if anything changes in that space. I mean more generally around, you talked a bit about mitigating circumstances and equality impact assessments. I mean, obviously, so as we've talked about at the moment, we're at a relatively early stage in our budget process. As we bring any budget proposals forward, whatever those budget proposals are, as they span people services, they span place services, we will need to make sure we are putting mitigating strategies in place and considering equalities impact assessment. So that's a very general statement, but that's absolutely what we have to do. That's I'm new into this role this year, but that's what we've done in previous years. That's what we'll obviously do this year. I don't know if
No, I mean, I think that covers it. And obviously, Nusri, as you said, the main way that it's formally done within budget setting process is the quality impact assessments. I guess what you're asking is for something earlier or as part of a scrutiny process to look at it more proactively. I guess we can think about that. It's certainly embedded in our thinking whenever we're thinking about budget decisions, is the impact on people with protected characteristics and vulnerable people in the city. It's at the forefront of anything we consider in terms of a budget decision, and then the actual formal consideration of any impact and mitigations comes through that quality impact assessment process.
Yes, Anna Sri.
No, thank you. I appreciate your answers. But I wondered if, because often we see it quite late in the day, and I wondered if there could be something that comes earlier so we can at least have a discussion and look at mitigation. I think the voluntary sector in particular have really great solutions and support and can look to bring funding into into this city. So I think it's worth starting those conversations earlier. And with my colleague sitting next to me, Jess, we're really lucky to have her today. It'd be really good to speak to her as she represents much of the voluntary sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, point taken, honestly, and a good point. Especially about protected characteristics and being older myself, I definitely think older people should get, quite a good support in prevention. Okay, so now I'm going to go to Jessica, who you have spoken before.
Thank you, Chair. Trying to avoid duplicating what's gone before, but essentially I'm coming back to the equality impact assessments and the timetable for consultation. I noticed the consultation is due to start November, December with partners around proposals. And I think as part of drafting those proposals, EIAs are absolutely essential. What we found before is mitigation sometimes hasn't necessarily been carried out with parties when the EIA is drafted and presented. So it'd be really good to get any kind of exploration of the equalities impact assessment early as on, even if it's before the government settlement. I think the quality of an EIA can make all the difference to the validity and the sustainability of the proposal, but also into our understanding and your understanding of the impact. So I think from the voluntary sector point of view, I'd echo what everybody else has said about the early use of that, and I can see we're in there as a stakeholder, but I think also as a vehicle for exploring options and opportunities. Think of us as a provider that could help you think creatively around some of that. Doesn't have to wait until the settlement. And if you're thinking about a proposal, which you've already said in the paper, directors are already thinking about that. What I would ask for is that shared conversation about it so we can really explore it and then have the detailed conversation when the settlement is released.
Yeah, so I mean, agreed, and we absolutely need to do that, and I think even if we're not publishing a sort of a full draft budget until we understand our settlement much more clearly, that's not to say that across our services, when we're working things up, we can't start to think about those impacts and start to make sure we have the relevant conversations in terms of how we can mitigate. So actually, in my view, that should help us ensure that what we're putting forward is deliverable, actually. So that really ought to make sense, and we really ought to do that anyway. So, I think it's sort of two important points you've made. I'll absolutely take that away and make sure that my colleagues and service directors that are working things up are starting to think about that early, and we can certainly make sure we get some guidance out to people to make sure that is happening. So yeah, I'll take that on board, Chair.
Thank you very much. I do think that's important because I know there are very good voluntary organisations in the city, not necessarily their contracts with Brighton and Hove either, but maybe with other authorities where they've suddenly been cut and it's been devastating to what they're offering. So I think that early consultation is really helpful. But I know it's difficult because you don't always know what money you're going to have. But as the voluntary sector does so much in this city, I think we have a brilliant relationship with the voluntary sector in the city. It's worth having those conversations early on. Okay, I think that is everybody. Did anybody else have a question to ask from this side? No, that's everybody. Oh, Councillor Shanks, you want to come back? That's fine.
No, it was just
fine.
I know we can make recommendations from here, and I think we've heard from a few people on that we need to have this earlier consultation, particularly with the voluntary sector. So I think that if that's something that you've agreed to as well, then I mean it needs to. I would have suggested it needs to try and happen before the end of the year. I mean we've often had late settlements, to be honest. So
I'd be very happy to make that recommendation. Is that something that can be done? That we can say that we would really like that conversation to be held as early as possible. I think it's very difficult. I know you're in a difficult position because you'll get the settlement in late and so on, but to try and bring it forward, because I know last year it was at this meeting that things were raised about some areas where there were going to be budget cuts, which hadn't actually really been discussed. And I think there was a huge sigh of relief in the voluntary sector when some of those were ultimately they were removed from cuts. So I think to avoid all that stress and panic and so on, it would be helpful. So is that possible for us to make a recommendation as a committee? Is that something you can deal with?
I guess you can make you certainly make a recommendation as a committee. But I mean, from our side, yes, absolutely. We want to bring it as early as possible. And by the way, for Cabinet, we would prefer to have a draft budget earlier because it means you're not scrabbling at the end of the process and defending stuff late in the process. So we would like to, and as we've said, it's somewhat dependent on the timing of the settlement, but even despite that, we can try and bring things as early as possible and have some of those proactive conversations with this committee and with the voluntary sector, certainly.
I think that would be very helpful. So I think the recommendation will generally be that we would like to have, if you can take that, that the committee is asking for an earlier discussion about any potential cuts. We want to talk to the voluntary sector about this. So does everybody agree to that? Yes. So we all agreed on that. Anne-Sophie.
I wasn't disagreeing, but is there a date? Could we have a date specified by when it would come, just to get some clarity?
I think that's difficult because that would involve us probably, I'm not sure. I would hope it would be before Christmas, but I know we can end up not hearing our final settlement because the Fire Authority doesn't get this either until you're almost right up to Christmas itself. I don't know if we can have a date, Anna-Sri. I definitely don't think we can have a date. We might get a general time.
I mean, we would like to publish a draft budget to Cabinet in December, which would then mean we could come to this committee and voluntary sector meetings in December, and that would be earlier than last year. So that's what we want to be able to do, December.
Yeah. So is that, yes, should we put December? To hold them to it, Anna-Sri.
If it's on paper, yeah, that'd be great.
Yes, we put it down on paper. So Luke, if you can put that down, that would be fantastic. Well, I think today has been very, very helpful in having a look at the issues of the budget. And I think we're all very much aware of the pressures. And I think that was very helpful when you talked, Councillor Taylor, about it wasn't just moving money from the south to the north, which I think the media have very much given that impression that that is what is going to happen, but it's actually deprived areas. And there are deprived areas in the south, and there are particularly deprived areas in coastal towns and so on, and also in the western counties, southwestern counties, I think in Cornwall in particular. So that helps to clarify that. I do think in a point about us being often held to ransom on certain services, it's because I think a lot of private equity companies have got involved, and some of them are international companies because they know we have statutory responsibilities, and that is, very challenging for us, I think, because we have to provide these services, and if we can't provide them ourselves, then we are a bit at the mercy of, sometimes some very, how can I put it, companies where they have, shareholders, etc., etc. So lots of pressure for the council, I think, lots of things to deal with. But I just want to say thank you for today. I think it has been very helpful in starting this process off, and thank you for answering all the questions so comprehensively. Thank you for your time. And now I'm going to call a break. I'm going to call a break for 10 minutes. Okay, so if we come back here at 2:45, I think that's time. Settle ourselves down. Mhm. What's his name? The full name? The guy from the NHS Trust. Okay. I didn't. Okay. Right. Our next item is a report on plans to renew the Section 75 agreement between the Council and Sussex Foundation Partnership Trust. Councillor Jacob Allen, would you like to present to the committee? And I know Steve Hook will be there to support you in that as well.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll just start with some introductions. So my name is Councillor Jacob Allen. I'm the Cabinet Member for Customer Services and Public Realm. But over the summer months, I've been covering for my colleague, Councillor Alexander, covering public health and adult social care. I'm joined by around Steve.
Thank you. Steve Hook. I'm Director of Adult Social Care.
John.
John Child, Chief Operating Officer for Sussex Partnership Trust.
And Richard.
Richard D'Souza, General Manager.
Wonderful. So if we just go to the first slide. So I'll just introduce. So the Section 75 agreement between Adult Social Care and Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust represents a long-standing model of integrated, person-centred approach to delivering care and support to our adult mental health community in Brighton and Hove, and this has been in place for over 23 years. Renewing this agreement in October meets our administration's council plan missions of being a fair and inclusive city, a healthy city where people thrive, and a responsive council with well-run services. The agreement and ways of working reflect the 5 pillars of our learning organisation in terms of being connected, innovative and creative. The aim is to continue the model of partnership and integrated working with Sussex Partnership Trust and embodies not only the council plan, but the integrated care partnership strategy, improving lives together across the health and care system in Sussex. However, I must make it clear that the recent publication of league tables for the NHS trusts does give our administration cause for concern. The schools rank trusts based on a range of measures, including finances, patient access to care, as well as bringing down waiting times for operations and A&E and improving ambulance response times. The partnership is placed 59th out of 61 trusts. We echo the comments made by Chris Ward, the Member of Parliament for Brighton, Kemp Town and Peacehaven, in saying that if we're going to fix our NHS, we need to be honest about where it's failing. We are not shy in saying we expect significant improvements from the Trust on a range of metrics, as our city faces unique health challenges, including mental health and multiple compound needs, which need focus and addressing. Our residents cannot be placed in a postcode lottery in health, and we will be keeping this in review and continuing conversations with both the Partnership Trust and the University Hospitals Trust. To that end, I would encourage the Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee to consider calling an item to give the Council assurance that improvements in the NHS Trust will be making to the quality of their service, and that they'll be implemented in a timely and robust fashion. Notwithstanding this, the recommendation before us here is to continue with renewing the Section 75 agreement with the Trust, working in partnership will benefit people with mental health needs rather than us working in isolation. Challenges remain, of course, but the benefits of joined up care, value for money, and the delivery of consistent person-centred care is something we really value and would like to see continue. For a lot of the detail in how the agreement works and what the practicalities are, I'll hand over to Steve, the Director of Adult Social Services, to run us through the rest of the slides.
Thank you, Councillor Allen. So I'm just going to take us briefly through the slide deck that came as part of today's papers. So as Councillor Allen has already referred, Section 75 agreement is a technical thing, and it's an agreement made between local authorities and NHS bodies, and can include arrangements for pooling budgets and resources. Our integrated care system that operates across Sussex has been a really significant structural reform with the aim of unifying plans around health strategies and also local authorities, in the hope that we will improve the efficiency and quality of healthcare services. And this Section 75 agreement is a significant tool in achieving an integrated and joined up approach around services. And this agreement contributes to improvement in mental health and well-being, and should result and continue to result in easier access to more responsive mental health services. Go on to the next slide, please. So the Section 75 arrangement in the City between the Council and Sussex Partnership Foundation Trust has been in place in various forms for just over 23 years. And it has meant in practical terms that our staff in adult social care have been co-located within the Trust to deliver its statutory duties, firstly under the Community Care Act and then under the Care Act. This way of working in close partnership has been valued by both of our organisations and by those individuals that use our services of the mental health community in the City. The review of this agreement seeks to maintain and strengthen the collaborative approach we've taken over the past 2 decades. And this agreement demonstrates the ongoing commitment of the Trust and the Council to work in partnership. We could have the next slide, please. So our aims and objectives around the agreement are to improve access to services, provide an integrated response and timely approach to assessment, treatment and care through joint working, so people don't have to tell their story a number of times. We promote a service that is based on people's assets and strengths and based on recovery and independence and outcomes. And it should provide a more seamless interface for users of our services and their carers. Next slide, please. In terms of statutory functions, we want to make sure that we continue to deliver an integrated service across social care and health that's compliant in our statutory duties, provide sufficient availability of staff and our workforce, make sure that our allocations of social care work, safeguarding work under the Care Act is robust, and make sure that our statutory duties as a council are discharged in accordance with the national guidelines. Next slide, please. In terms of the management of our staff, within this agreement, managers are both fully conversant across the NHS and across the council with the duties their teams must deliver. We have sufficient systems in place, both across the NHS Trust and the council, to make sure that our statutory duties are discharged and ensure that staff working within both of our services are given the necessary tools to do their job. The arrangements we have in the City are that our adult social care social workers in mental health are co-located and hosted with colleagues within the Trust and are fully integrated into the Trust and use Trust recording systems, so they work seamlessly as part of a single service. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail, but committee members will note that the agreement contains a detailed section of schedules that set out the detailed working arrangements, our performance indicators, and our financial arrangements for the agreement. Next slide, please. In terms of the management structure,
Over the past 3 years, since 2022, in the City Council, we've increased the management resource allocated to the agreement so that as a council, we have greater oversight of our statutory duties. Our General Manager, Richard D'Souza, who will be here to answer any technical questions that committee members may have, is the lead in terms of our relationship with the Trust overseeing this agreement. And we work collaboratively with Sussex Partnership Managers, both in the acute hospital at Millview and also across community and urgent care services to make sure of the delivery of those statutory duties across the city. There are some significant challenges that come with the arrangement. It makes for more complex governance and accountability when you put services together, particularly when they're based across different kinds of legislation. We do have some complex financial arrangements with the Trust, in as much as we co-fund practitioners and clinicians across the arrangement. Within the Trust, they are developing a new way of working called neighbourhood mental health teams, which is very much in keeping with the new integrated agenda across the NHS and across the city. The neighbourhood mental health teams will be coterminous with our integrated community teams through primary care and through the rest of our community healthcare services. We know that another challenge, particularly around mental health in the city, is around demand. So we're quite a young city, particularly compared to our East and West Sussex neighbours. 72% of the city is aged between 16 and 66, and therefore part of our population and demography means that demand for mental health services across the city are high, and that continues to be a challenge that we will work on together. However, in terms of the benefits, if we could go on to the slide for the benefits, please. Thank you. Joined up care enable a more seamless coordination between health and social care. We work towards shared goals across health and social care and are able to deliver a more person-centred approach. And we're also able to deliver a greater continuity of care. So the join up between community mental health services and social care services is much better under this arrangement. And it supports the national direction of government to deliver more integrated community-based care and support. So our proposal around the Section 75 arrangement that, as I've said, has been in place in one form or another since the early part of the 2000s, is that it's scheduled for renewal in October this year, and we propose that committee note the contents of the report and support the recommendation to renew the agreement. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very helpful. And so I'll now go to John, if you would like to add some comments.
Thank you very much. I haven't really got much more to add to what Steve and Councillor Allen have said. I guess it's just a couple of points to stress. So one is obviously the long-standing nature of the arrangement. It's been in place for a long period of time within Brighton and Hove across our mental health services, both our adults and older adults. Sussex Partnership Trust remains very keen to work in partnership with the City Council. We fundamentally believe this model provides better outcomes for patients for all the reasons that Steve described. Less patients having to less frequently tell their story, more integrated teams, close multidisciplinary working. Steve mentioned briefly the strategic direction of travel towards neighbourhood mental health teams within the city, and that's on a pan-Sussex basis. That's a direct relation to integrated care teams. It is in effect the neighbourhood mental health teams version of integrated care teams. And for that reason, we would want to continue to work in partnership with the City Council. Happy to take any questions from the committee.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we can go to questions from people. Yeah, so I got Sarah. I got Sue, I got Julie, I got Josh, engage, Councillor Winder? No? Okay. Yeah, I've got you down, number 3. I've got you down. I saw you. Huh? Yeah, I got you down. Yeah, no, I didn't miss you. Yeah, the old teacher thing coming in. You do notice. Okay. So I'm going to start off with you. Is it Sarah or Sarah?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I didn't get time to plough through all those papers, I'm afraid. Not as a volunteer. But, I suppose the question for me was, what's the difference that's making the difference? Why did it come to scrutiny now? What are the risks? You have pointed out some of the risks, I know, Steve, but I guess the concern for us is, again, it's an older people's emphasis really, but not just for us, but for the whole of Brighton and Hove. The trust is coterminous, as you said, with the integrated care teams. It's East Sussex, West Sussex and Brighton and Hove. What we've already seen with the dementia beds is that they've been taken away from Brighton and Hove and gone to Uckfield or Worthing, which has got a huge implication for people visiting. Most people visiting older people with dementia are older themselves. They're not easy journeys. So how do we protect and get a proper voice in Brighton and Hove for Brighton and Hove service users in a system that is so wide? And I believe that the adult social care staff from the council, they're seconded, aren't they? But are in the minority in a health trust. So, how do we retain a really strong voice for people in Brighton and Hove through this?
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sarah. I think in terms of your questions around the concern around older people services, I think first of all, around the acute dementia beds, I mean, that has been discussed and debated at some length at HOSC, and John will come in and talk to that agenda. I think in terms of how do we make sure there's a proper voice for people who use that service and use services in the city, as part of the governance around this, we have a mental health oversight board in the city. And that board is attended by the council and by the trust and by colleagues from the voluntary sector. And we also work quite closely with an organisation called the League, which is the Lived Experience Advisory Group. The League have a very strong voice on that mental health oversight board. They're very good at holding us to task and asking challenging questions. And so I think we've got systems and governance set up to make sure that people that use those services have their voice heard and have their voice listened to. In terms of older people's beds and dementia beds in the city, notwithstanding the closure of the acute ward, which John will talk about in a moment, we have opened an additional 6 beds at Arnon Lodge, specifically around step-down care, around dementia. And we've obviously retained Arnon Lodge as an in-house service and also Wayfield Avenue. So I think in terms of council provision and in terms of making sure that in the city, the social care voice is prominent, I think our joint arrangements reflect that. You're right in as much as against the large NHS trust, council staff are in a minority. That's just because it's a very large community trust. However, as I've mentioned in the presentation, for the last 3 years, we've modified that agreement and we've employed our own adult social care managers to properly manage the Care Act work that we do and ensure the right kind of governance around both our assessments and our safeguarding activity. So we know that in other areas of the country where the NHS has managed social care work, that's not been successful. I think in the city, we've got the best of both worlds because we've introduced extra governance and a resource to manage the social care work so that it has a voice whilst retaining our integrated arrangements.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Sarah, you mentioned integrated care teams, and I think the size of the Sussex partnership. So the move to neighbourhood mental health teams is not unique to Brighton and Hove. It is an arrangement that we're seeking to take place in West and East Sussex as well. For the committee's background, so the changes to the inpatient services at Millview Hospital, which was the conversion of the inpatient ward for dementia to an adult inpatient ward, has been presented twice to the Health and Overview Scrutiny Committee. I'm happy to talk to the detail, but I think we've probably done it quite a lot in that setting. But Steve did mention, I think, some numbers about population need. The crux of that discussion was about population need. Adult acute psychiatric care was a greater need to the population of the city than older adults and dementia care, which we felt could adequately be provided within other areas, notwithstanding the impact on families and carers as we discussed. In addition to the additional governance arrangements that Steve has mentioned for the City Council and the management of the Section 75 agreement, Sussex Partnership Trust holds a professional lead role in the organisation around social work and social care. We have a director of social work, and we have an increasingly high number of social workers that we directly employ across the trust. So whilst I understand that the social care staff will be in the minority, they will be within a growing social care workforce within the NHS, which, as an provider of integrated care, feels integral to what we're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Do you want to come back on that, Sarah?
Why has it come to scrutiny now? Why is it seen as a scrutiny thing?
So you're right. My understanding is this hasn't been to a scrutiny committee before when it's been up for renewal. I am assuming that it's because of the changes in our own governance here at Brighton Hove City Council, that because we're now a cabinet system, there has to be a member, i.e. me, behind partnership deals like this, and that therefore means it's open to scrutiny by all of you, and that's certainly something we welcome.
Yes, just to add to that, Sarah, when I was on the committee for children and families and so on, this sort of thing would come to that committee and we would scrutinise it and make recommendations and say, well, we'd like to have a look at that in a year's time. If it was a 5-year contract, we just wanted to keep track of it. So it's the change in governance at the council that means it's coming here. Okay, which I think is a good thing that we're seeing things like this. So thank you very much, Councillor Allen. So I'm now going to go to Councillor Meadows. Yes.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yeah, on page 48, 3.12, it talks about the increase in demands placed on both Sussex Partnership Trust and the council, and that they're regularly assessed and reviewed. I just wondered, if the increase in demands are regularly assessed, what about jobs and the amount of staff that you have to do the job appropriately? Is that regularly assessed? Because with all our budget demands, and I'm looking at the new financial implications here, £95,000 of the council budget is over spent, if you like to say that. So one question is, do we have more staff than required? Second question is, we've already established that council staff are in the minority, so do we have a say on how many staff could be used, and why isn't that regularly assessed? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Meadows. In terms of our staffing, I think it's fair to say that in the public sector, we're all challenged and working in a world across both the local authority and the NHS, where we've got increasing demand and not necessarily a staffing resource that is increasing to meet that demand. However, the essence of this agreement is that by integrating our clinicians that work in the trust and our social workers, that we reduce lots of duplication and deliver a much more efficient service. So we know that patients who've got mental health needs often don't want to have to describe their condition and their story twice. They don't want to have to get ping-ponged between health services and social care services. There are then added inefficiencies that are added in by social care services and health services using two different recording systems. So given the finance staffing resource that we have, we do make sure that we deliver that in the most efficient and effective way possible. In terms of how we manage increasing demand, we have to risk assess who we allocate for assessments. We certainly don't have more staff than required, so we're not operating at a surplus. But in terms of how do we have a say, we do have a joint management group that meets as part of this agreement, and I think it's in one of the schedules. At that group, we have, as John has mentioned, we have the trust lead for social work. We also have our own principal social worker, and Richard and I meet regularly with the trust to review what staff we need. And so at various points across the arrangement, and what we've done in the last few years is we might, when a post comes up, have a conversation and say, well, actually, do we want to replace that post with the existing community mental health nurse, or actually does it need to be a social worker, because that's where the demand is? And so having the pooled agreement does enable us to be more flexible across the piece about how we deploy our workforce, and that's not really possible unless you have this arrangement in place. John?
Oh, sorry, John.
So, very similar principles. It's no secret, is it, that as the NHS, like local government, is experiencing significant financial challenges, and of course an area of that is real attention to our workforce. Not dissimilar to what Steve's described, I think. So whilst we have a finite amount of finite workforce, in managing demand is a couple of areas. So one, we will obviously work closely with our commissioners, with NHS Sussex, but for us it's around service redesign. So I was just described to Sarah, obviously, the example that we had around dementia and adult inpatient beds. There's something within the financial envelopes, which we all have, of designing our services to meet the population need as best we can. And some of that is around skill mix. So whether, as Steve describes, whether we should have a social care member of staff or a health member of staff, and really trying to sort of change our services to flex the population need.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm now going to go to Councillor McLean.
Thanks very much. And thanks for your report on this. So one question is whether there have been any lessons learned from the current agreement that will then inform the renewal. For example, will you be looking to ensure that services remain flexible and responsive to emerging needs? And where there's reference throughout the paper about person-centred care, performance indicators, value for money, I wanted to ask, are there any feedback mechanisms in place currently that capture the service user experience, and where that might look at, how you are addressing barriers that they're experiencing? So thank you. 2 questions from me.
Thank you, Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Councillor McLean. I think in terms of lessons learned, I may bring Richard in a moment, but I guess the agreement's been running a long time, and each time we come to review, we do have sort of lessons that we've learned from the last iteration of the agreement. And as I said last time round, we took the decision to think about how the agreement was contained within the staffing and the management, and we appointed our own managers to make sure that Care Act and social care duties were effectively discharged. In terms of how services remain flexible, as we've indicated, as part of the agreement, we have a joint operational team and joint management team that meet regularly every quarter. Those are meetings where we look at our performance indicators that are in one of the schedules. We look at how the performance is being managed. And we also take some of those sort of local performance indicators to our mental health oversight board, which is kind of citywide, and that deals with both our adult mental health issues and our older adults issues. As I think I mentioned before, we work quite closely with the League, the Lived Experience Advisory Group. They have a strong voice on that board. They quite frequently challenge us around how services are configured and their experience of services, and we're obviously duty bound to respond to that. I did wonder whether, Richard, you had anything else to say around kind of lessons learned?
Yeah, just further on from Stephen, in terms of lessons learned, as part of this review, what we've done is we've reviewed each individual schedule that was obviously created 3 years ago. We do that on an annual basis. We took the time out to review each individual schedule as part of this review that's been presented here. Some still are in draft version, and we're still waiting for final comments. But one instance, like we have a joint operational group, and what we've decided to do with that is actually from lessons learned from before is split that into an older adults dedicated operational group and an adults, because we know like the pressures are different, the queries that come out, the demands. So by splitting that is actually it makes it work a lot better for us as a system, so we can prioritise key focus on each group. So yeah, we have taken the time to look at each of those schedules as part of this.
I'd just add that beyond that, of course, we don't just look at how this has worked for Brighton and Hove. We can look at the alternative, which is not to have one of these agreements, which is status quo in East Sussex and West Sussex. And having garnered insights on that process, which members may wish to probe, we have decided that it would be better for people in our city to stay in this agreement.
Thank you very much. Yeah. John, you wanted to say something.
Thanks. I think part of your question was around outcomes for patients. So I appreciate these are very much more NHS performance metrics, but we have a number of areas where we capture patient outcome data in a number of our services, and that would equally be valid for colleagues with social care staff. There is an annual survey, a community mental health survey, which is a national survey for all community mental health teams. And again, some of the questions within that are relevant again for social care services. And then there's outcomes for staff. So the staff survey, the National NHS Staff Survey, again, there'll be relevance for city council staff who are co-located with us. So there are a number of outcome measures that we would look at as well.
Do you want to come back on that at all, Councillor? Okay.
Thanks for that clarity, though. That was really good to understand, and interesting the comparisons that you've been witnessing, Councillor Allen.
Thank you very much. Anna 3.
Thank you, Chair. It's good to hear about the growth and positive reconfiguration of Brighton and Hove Council's role in safeguarding. So that was just a comment, not anything required. So that's really good to hear. So in light of this renewal of Section 75 and your focus on person-centred approach, I had a couple of questions, one on data and one on access and inclusion. And the data one was, what proportion of people were accessing services are captured by the equalities monitoring? And in particular, I'm interested in race, and how is it used to shape service improvement? And the second question was, how is the partnership addressing barriers faced by Black and racial minoritized communities in accessing mental health support? Thank you.
Thanks, Anusri. If I just make a start, in terms of our equalities monitoring, I don't have the detailed figure on top of my head, but we can send that to you outside of here. But we do, through our Mental Health Oversight Board and through our Joint Management Group, have performance indicators related to protected characteristics and equalities. We also have, within adult social care, our Department Equalities Delivery Group. And within that, we've identified a number of issues around the barriers accessed by Black and global majority communities. In terms of our Mental Health Oversight Board, Our lived experience advisory group has very good representation from black and global majority users of our service, and also their carers. So their experience has directly fed into the way that we configure services and the plans that we've got to change some of the way we deliver those services. So we do have mechanisms in place to do that. In terms of the actual percentage figures, we can go away and get those. We can send those to you. I don't know, John, whether you wanted to add to that.
I can add a little bit to that. So as a mental health trust, and in keeping with a number of trusts, we are fully signed up to the patient and carer race equality framework. There are some long-standing, deep-seated inequalities within mental health care that are well documented, particularly around detention under the Mental Health Act. And alongside that, we report regularly on our workforce race equality framework. Both of these are reported through our board. They are areas which they are led by our Chief Medical Officer. I'd happily provide more detail in a written response if that were helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great. And I know that there's been a lot of work in the workforce space, because I'm really interested in services, because there is so much unmet need and people are not accessing, they don't even know about free services, like wonderful stuff that does happen in the city. And I wondered, I'd be really interested to hear some really, I don't doubt there is good work going on, but it'd be good to hear about it, if that's okay. I'd really appreciate a response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna 3. So now I'm going to go to Julie Cattell.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that I've come across in my role as corporate chair of corporate parenting board is that care leavers have got very specific needs for their mental health care, which differs in some ways to other people of their age. And they did actually present to us at the last board meeting their feelings about mental health and how for them there's a lot of additional trauma that comes from being a care leaver. So I just wondered if that is something that could be considered. I mean, like Sarah said about hearing the voice of older people, this is me saying, can we hear the voice of care leavers? Thank you.
I'm happy to take that question. At the last Health and Overview Scrutiny Committee, we had a report on children and adolescent mental health services, and we touched on this. I think you may have been there, but specifically around how within statutory mental health services we record the looked after status of children and young people, or whether we don't, and how do we make reasonable adjustments for in services as a result of that. In the relevance to the Section 75 agreement, which is just for adults and older adult services, we do run obviously child and adolescent mental health services, which are not integrated with the City Council, but we obviously work very closely with them. In terms of how do we recognise the impact of trauma on children and young people and people who have experienced the care system, I think our clinicians at the HOSC describe the trauma-informed care that we provide, particularly within those services. So it's certainly an approach that we're very live to. And when we're making clinical prioritisation decisions and clinically led decisions, we would be including people's individual presentation, which is related to their experience of being in care.
I just have a supplementary. So some of the care leavers would be young adults, so they would be 18, so they would fall into this partnership agreement. So that's what I'm because obviously they don't just suddenly disappear when they hit 18. So just thinking about that continuity of looking at them as slightly, the special circumstances hopefully will carry on.
You're absolutely right. So when people become adults, if they have adult social care needs, they would fall under the banner of this arrangement. The key for us is around the transitions process. The transitions process between child and adolescent mental health services and adult mental health services, I think it's well recognised nationally that that's an area that requires constant attention, that the needs are quite different, the services are quite different, but we do have a well-defined process working with our children's and adult social care partners. But I think Steve's going to comment on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess just to add, and committee members will have or may remember this coming to people of you and scrutiny previously, we do have a transition strategy that's being signed off hopefully by the end of this month. And within that strategy, there are two specific care pathways. One is around mental health and the other is around care leavers. So I think we do recognise the complexity, particularly that care leavers face, and we know that in the city, care leavers have been included in our protected characteristics. Some care leavers will meet the criteria for adult social care support, and not all of them will. That notwithstanding, our social work staff in adult mental health have also received trauma-informed practice training, so their approach around social work and assessment is very much based on a trauma-informed approach.
Thank you, thank you. And now I have Councillor Parrott, please.
Yeah, I've heard a lot today about an integrated care approach, and I'm aware that Sussex Partnership Foundation Trust did apply to be part of the pilot programmes for community-based mental health hubs and didn't make that, unfortunately. I've read this document quite thoroughly, and my view would be that we're still looking at a prevention-based approach. Well, we're not looking at a prevention-based approach, actually. We're still looking at a very reactive-based approach. So I don't really see that we're moving towards a much more community-based, prevention-based approach. And I think particularly with mental health and, you know, our prevalence of neurodiversity in the city, which is part of our inclusion and the vibrancy of the city and the people that are in the city, you know, this concerns me that we're not looking at that, and I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing a kind of one door approach, a right front door approach to everything that we're providing. So I'd like to ask about that, and what are our steps, and where are we moving towards a more prevention based approach. The 10-year NHS plan sets out very clearly that we should be moving towards that, and obviously we've heard today about finances, and that prevention clearly is better than cure, and probably in the end less expensive. I'd just also like to bring an experience I had this morning, if that's okay, which is I sat on the Autism Partnership Board. The Autism Partnership Board is a very, very well produced, co-produced board that works very, very closely with the autistic community. These are autistic people without learning difficulties as well, as in, you know, so people with learning disabilities are, you know, very different. And they are struggling to get anyone from SPFT to attend. And, you know, I was really disappointed in that, because this is a very well-produced board that brings an awful lot of good work and is working very hard, in fact, to meet those needs. Given that autistic people are 10 times more likely, for example, to have suicidal ideation, so we're seeing a lot of mental health issues in that group, and particularly that autistic group without learning difficulties, who really are under supported and under cared for, and there isn't a specific pathway for them within what we're currently providing. Sorry, I realise there's quite a lot wrapped up in that, and I could probably sit here and grill you for hours about this, or talk about this for hours. So I'm going to be quiet now.
Thank you, thank you. Good points, Councillor Parrott.
Thanks very much. I'll try and come back on those questions. So you're right that we bid as part of the bid from Brighton and Hove City, from Brighton and Hove, not just City Council, Brighton and Hove, around the neighbourhood model. We were fortunately successful. We were successful as part of the bid for Hastings and Rother. I appreciate that doesn't necessarily mean anything to here. However, from us as an organisation that does obviously work on a bigger footprint, we will be able to take the learnings from that and bring them back into the city. We've mentioned in passing the neighbourhood mental health team model. So for us, that would be a more preventative model, because that's not just about secondary mental health care services. That is around the amalgamation of primary care mental health care services, what we describe as our emotional wellbeing services, NHS talking therapy services, which you may have been familiar with, known as IAPT, into a more holistic model. The premise being fewer front doors for people, one referral process and you're in, and that model of care will be delivered in partnership with the community and voluntary sector and adult social care. I think it's fair to say that that is an emerging model, and it's not fully landed yet. You mentioned the Autism Partnership Board. I'd already met with Andy Witham as one of your lead commissioners and agreed with him, I think a couple of weeks ago, that our Associate Clinical Director for Neurodevelopmental Services would attend the next partnership, the Autism Partnership Board, and present an update on the areas where Sussex Partnership Trust is the areas that we're delivering in terms of autism, and again, against the particular areas in the plan. That's why she didn't attend today, because she only came back from leave last week.
The feedback from the partnership board this morning was that it's quite poor, that really there is only one person that could attend and that leave. You know, there is a lot of anger in the community around the lack of attendance and the lack of input and the perceived the fact that it doesn't seem to be important or to matter. And just to come back, I'm very aware of IAPT and the psychological talking therapies. I'm a psychotherapist by training. I've worked for 20 years in the city, and so I'm very aware of you know, the services that are there. I think that you know, it's not going far enough, and there's an awful lot more work to be done.
Right, thank you very much, Councillor Parrott. And now we go to Councillor Shanks, please.
Thank you very much. I think we've had quite a good discussion of this. It's quite, I was familiar with what these Section 75 agreements are, but I suppose just looking at it now, you think, why are we starting from here? Because if you wouldn't start from here, really, would you? You wouldn't have two services working together. You'd have one service providing everything in a way. I don't know, but I'm interested. I didn't realise that East and West Sussex did it differently. I suppose my question is, what are there other models in the country that, you know, we could look at? I mean, really, it needs the reform of adult social care, doesn't it? Because that would presumably look at whether adult social care would be a service that the NHS provided, because that's been talked about before in a way of moving everything into the NHS. Obviously, we've got concerns about the way that behaves. So I suppose it's just, you know, you've got two separate organisations that you're trying to make work together. Actually, you know, it would be easier if you just had one. But we can't have one. I know that. I was just like, just listening to that, I thought this is a bit silly. Yeah, so are there what other happens elsewhere apart from East and West Sussex? Because if we were really scrutinising this properly, we'd probably need to look at what would be another alternative. You know, this has obviously worked reasonably well for 23 years and difficult to dismantle. But, you know, if you were going to say, well, how can we make it work better? And, you know, Councillor Parrott just said it's not perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Shanks. I mean, I guess that, you know, you speak to a national issue really around sort of health and social care governance, don't you? And the facts are that, you know, we're currently configured where we have NHS trusts that provide healthcare to people, and then we have local authorities that are constituted to do social work and provide social care for people. So, you know, that's the current sort of national structure. And of course, there have been lots of discussions, haven't there, between various administrations around whether social care basically goes in with the NHS and we all become employed by the NHS. That's not the case at the moment. And I think the arrangement that we are developing in the city gives us the best of both worlds. So we do work in a world of statutory regulation. In adult social care, we just this year come under regulation by the Care Quality Commission. So there are rules that we will have to meet according to how they set out we should deliver services, and it's the same with NHS trusts. We're also subject to different statute, different law. So the way that things are structured nationally doesn't make it easy for there to be one organisation that does the lot. However, I think that the arrangement we have in this city has worked as well as it can for a long time. I think we've already talked about Scrutiny this evening around how we are learning from previous iterations of the agreement. And in terms of what happens elsewhere in the country, there aren't too many different ways you can cut this cake, really. You can either deliver services in as seamless a way as you can between the NHS and social care, or you deliver them separately with kind of different rules about how you communicate and pass referrals from A to B. The arrangements we've got between the trust and the council at the moment reflect a long history of cooperative working, collaborative working and integration. And honestly speaking, other places where I've worked where there have been some fairly messy divorces between the NHS and the local authority, what tends to have happened is that both parties have had to invent other forms of governance, and patients have not had as good a service as a result.
Thank you.
I'd just add to that by saying, the options are either you're in a section 75 or you're not, and East and West Sussex's direction of travel, they chose to not sign, and they've had to deal with the consequences of that. As Steve says, this has been Brighton and Hove has been in this agreement for most of my lifetime, and it was last renewed under the administration Councillor Shanks was in. So her colleagues at the time would have come to the same conclusion that we did, that this is the best avenue for delivering care to people in Brighton and Hove.
Thank you. Yes, and just to add a comment in there, because I think I spoke to you about this, Steve, because this reminded me in a way of front door families, where you have the police are embedded in with social workers, and I'm sure you've been up there and seen that, Councillor Shanks, and I would hope other people have, because it's fascinating. But what you get is their works seamlessly almost. And it means the speed of things is much greater. Things passed on very quickly. You tend to have better communication as well, because it's, you're there and you have better systems working for it. And so often what we hear in many cases is, well, this department wasn't talking to that department, and, this got missed and that got missed. So whatever faults it has, I think this system where you have people embedded, as we have social workers embedded in the Sussex Partnership Trust, I do think that tends to produce better communications, better results, and speedier action. Adam, I'll come to you in a minute. But anyway, I have Josh now.
Hi. I think it's been covered partially already, but I just had a question for Jacob in terms of our arrangements and how they effectively kind of complement the government's move towards neighbourhood health. So it's just thinking kind of succinctly, if you could kind of answer that, that'd be really useful.
I will certainly try. So the 10-year NHS plan, which was announced earlier in the summer by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care and the Prime Minister, is certainly something we as an administration welcome, kind of trying to devolve healthcare out of hospitals and institutions into our communities, where more preventative and innovative work can be done on improving health outcomes. And we are of the view that signing up to or renewing our Section 75 agreement with the Sussex Partnership Trust will only go to further enhance and entrench that direction of travel and that work.
Not really, Councillor. And I think what's really clear is that over the next 10 years with the NHS plan, there is a move from acute care to community care. That will signal, hopefully, a shift in resources. And so it's really important that we configure our community mental health services in a way that they can make the best use of that resource when it happens. I think the other thing that we've spoken about this evening is very often with our mental health community in the city, they face lots and lots of health inequalities. So mainstream access to primary care and GPs, mainstream access to district nursing, all of those community healthcare services that the general population take for granted is much more difficult to access for people with mental health needs and also our neurodiverse community. Co-locating our neighbourhood mental health teams with our integrated community teams will hopefully do a similar job to what's been done with locating our social care and mental health teams together, in as much as they should be able to access mainstream primary care services more easily, because currently mental health teams are configured, not in that way. So we do think it's the right direction of travel.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Julie Cattell, you had.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. The council and the NHS have, for example, their own strategies, for example, when it comes to tackling violence against women and girls. Well, I'm sure they're broadly similar in their aims. Are these wider corporate strategies reconciled and reflected in the shared governance of the Section 75 agreement?
I mean, the short answer is yes. If you look at the schedules within the agreement, we have a range of shared policies and procedures. Now, our staff from the council that are seconded and work with colleagues in mental health, they're party to all of the mandatory training that the trust receive, and similarly, clinicians and practitioners within the trust have access to council services. I think also, particularly in terms of violence against women and girls, I'm not specifically aware of a trust policy around that, but our staff have all the relevant training in those issues. We are on the rota for MARAC and MAPA, so we make sure that we fully participate in all of those issues. And as part of our joint management group, of course, we make sure our workforce are properly up to date around those key issues. So our schedule sets out the joint arrangements for both staff across the trust and the council, and it makes sure that they do have access to the relevant training in those areas.
Thanks very much. So just to add to that, obviously, Steve mentioned MAPA and MARAC, of which as we're key statutory partners as well. Violence against women and girls will obviously fall under our wider safeguarding policies. All NHS trusts operate under the framework of patient safety investigation. It used to be called serious incident investigations, but now it's patient safety investigation, and that will pick up any particular learnings related to this topic. There's some very specific things that we have to report on related to this. For example, we have to report on mixed sex accommodation. So within our inpatient wards, we have to report on the numbers of men and women who perhaps share a ward, mixed sex breaches. So it's an area of particular scrutiny for us.
Can I just ask a supplementary? How well do you think that spending decisions have followed these agreed priorities from both sides of the fence, as it were? Okay.
National spending decisions or locals? It's a good question. From our perspective, I think we would say that this agenda falls under the banner of the quality of the care that we seek to provide to our patients, and that is a priority for us at all times. There is, of course, it would be fair to say, a tension, as there is within many public services at the minute, between the quality of the services that we want to and we do provide versus the financial position, and that's something that we're very live to.
Thank you. And then I have Adam, who has, this is the last question, but you might get a comment from me at the end. So, Adam.
Thank you very much. I'll start with an apology for some ignorance around this, and also an acknowledgement that officers present and Cabinet Lead might not be the best people to answer this, but CAMS was mentioned, and given the long-standing successful nature of this relationship, has a Section 75 been explored for CAMS services? And if not, why not? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much. Straightforward answer, no, it hasn't. But going back to Councillor Shank's point or question around models of care across the country. So Section 75 agreements have really only ever been for adults and older adults mental health services. They've never been in place in the same way for child and adolescent mental health services and children's social care. But the chair mentioned front door for families. I think there are some equivalent models around integrated services, whether it's through single points of access, front door for families, which to some extent provide the same outcomes for children and young people. They're not exactly the same, but there is definitely a model of integrated care.
If I could just come in with a further to John's answer, I think very often it's a question of scale and the way services are configured. So if you think about a young person growing up to adulthood, they're a young person for 17 years, they're an adult for the next 40, 50, 60. And so the way that services are configured nationally means that every local authority will employ an adult social work team that deals with the mental health community because it will be of a certain size. That then clearly matches with the capacity and the way that services are delivered to adults in an NHS trust. Through children's services, the services are just configured very differently. And so that integration of services wouldn't necessarily work because you don't have two equivalent things that you can match together. So quite often, young people will develop mental health needs and will be served through CAMS, which is a clinical service, it's a healthcare service. You won't have children's mental health social work teams because the services aren't configured that way, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. And I think Councillor Parrott, you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well in regard to that actually with things like CAMS, you're focusing on, which is what Steve just said. You are focusing very much on mental health of the child, whereas with adults, of course, you've got ramifications for the adult around housing, benefits, employment, etc. So there is a need for more coordinated, joined up thinking in that respect. Whereas with children, it is about trying to bring in parents, carers who will be, help and support that child through some of those issues. I guess that would be where the splits would come.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, there are lovely examples that I remember from children's committee as well, where they worked with there were partnerships, and I think, I can't remember if the NHS was involved, but they had an accountability board and so on, and it was for accommodation for young people who had special needs or disabilities, shared housing, shared supported housing, because it was in fact better financially to do it that way. So I think there are other examples of this kind of partnership working and so on, which, I think is often very effective. What I wanted to ask about was the fact that we have a large number of young people in this city, and we also have 2 universities and various colleges and so on. And we also have, because I'm thinking of the drug and alcohol strategy that came to this committee, and, in speaking to my GPs, I know that they think that one of the big issues with young people with mental health problems is drug addiction. And so I just wondered how much of a increasing issue that was in you dealing with this. It's not quite what we're on, but obviously you're going to be providing resources, you're going to be working out who you will be seeing and, what you need to provide. And I just wondered if you could comment on that, because I think it's a big issue for the city.
I'll start. It certainly can intersect the drugs and alcohol strategy, which I presented at Cabinet, speaks to that. Of course, it can be related, it can't be related, but in many cases it can exacerbate those issues which stem from trauma, things like that. So it's certainly something we're aware of, and I'll let Richard talk about the practicalities.
Thank you. Yes, I think drug and alcohol issues are a significant challenge within the city, and they're certainly something that we experience a lot within our services. And we have a number of patients who present with both mental health issues and drug and alcohol or substance misuse issues. Currently, the provision is delivered by an organisation called Care Grow Live, CGL, and we do work closely with them. We have, as you would expect us to have, dual diagnosis strategies. We have a number of dual diagnosis workers who work within our neighbourhood mental health teams. We have a consultant psychiatrist who leads on that across the trust. But it would certainly be disingenuous of me if I didn't stress that is a real challenge for us. And we do see a high prevalence of drug and alcohol use within our patients. It's not a barrier for accessing mental health services. I know that that's previously been a concern, which is why we wanted to develop particular workers to ensure that patients presenting with those issues can access our services and receive care and treatment.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for answering the many questions and for your presentation. I think it's been extremely helpful in understanding how these kind of partnerships work. And I know that they do have their challenges. So we will now move to the recommendation. Do members agree to note the contents of the report, including the recommendation to renew the Section 75 agreement for a further 3 years? Are we all agreed? Yes, in some ways I'd quite like to know how it's going as well. So I might speak to, I think it would be Councillor Alexander actually about that. So I shall now call the meeting to a close, which everybody should be happy with that because you all get to go before 7. Okay, thank you very much.